Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. My name is Egberto Willies, your host. Today, we're honored once again to have Dr. Richard D. Wolff. Dr. Richard D. Wolff is the professor of economics emeritus at University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is Understanding Capitalism and is available along with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at www.democracyatwork.info, among the many other books that he has written. Of course, Dr. Wolff, welcome again to Politics Done Right.
Well, it's a pleasure, Egberto. Every time I talk with you, I get emails of appreciation for you, for me. It's very heady experience, so believe me, I enjoy it.
Well, look, thank you so kindly. Look, I want us to discuss some truths about capitalism and why the income inequality and wealth disparities that have been realized is not an accident, but a designed outcome. So why don't you take that away and run with it, please?
Okay. You know, human beings in the course of our history as a species, human beings have come up with a variety of ways of doing what we call economics. And all I mean by that is producing the food, the clothing, the shelter that we need to live on, and distributing the output, the houses, the bushels of corn, the shirts, amongst us. I mean, that's the problem of economics. Get it produced and then get it distributed. And for example, in much of the early history of our species, we did this in small groups. We call them villages, in which we organized, okay, how do we get the bread baked? How do we get the housing built? How do we take care of our kids? All the usual problems. Then at later stages in our development, we changed. It's a long story. We don't have the time for it, but we reorganized it and we broke away from doing it as a group in a kind of collective way. All of us pretty much equal, men, women, older, younger, and we developed a system called slavery, which most people think emerged from clashes between groups of villages, and the winner became the master and the loser became the slave of the master. Long story short, some people were in a position to control the situation, to decide what gets produced and how it gets produced and where and who produces it, and the big one, who gets it when it's produced. And if you remember what you learned about slavery, you know that a very small group of people, known as masters, had the power to control the situation, and the mass of people were the slaves who did the actual work. Feudalism came later, at least in the West, and there you had a small group of lords and a mass group of serfs. Why am I telling you this? You'll see how it answers your question. We now live in capitalism, and capitalism is like slavery and feudalism. It didn't want to be. The people who made capitalism happen had bigger dreams, better dreams, but they ended up replacing the serf or the slave with the employee, and the master or the lord with the employer, and therefore inherited and maintained the fundamental inequality. The U.S. Census tells us that 3% of Americans are employers. The other 97%, you, Egberto, and me, we are employees. We are not employers. Okay, now let's understand what that means. The employers, those are the people who own and operate a business. Those are the people who are the boards of directors of large corporations, and they're the ones who are the major players these days. Those are the employers. And because, here comes the punchline, because capitalism gives them the position to decide what gets produced, how it gets produced, where it gets produced, and what's done with it when it's distributed, these employers have done something which surprises no one. They've taken the bulk of the output and given it to themselves, just as the masters did in slavery, just as the lords did in feudalism. That's why if you go to Europe, you're a tourist, you visit the great chateaus. That's what the lords arranged for their serfs to produce. If you go to the great ruins of slavery, same thing. If you go to the great mansions of capitalist America, same thing. You see what we do. Well, that's a recipe for inequality. That's a recipe that those who sit at the top, keep enriching themselves. Let me give you the latest numbers that come from Oxfam in England. That's that charity that keeps track of global wealth. We've been doing it for a century. It's the most reliable source of data. They tell us that of the roughly 3,000 billionaires in the world today, that's all. We have 7 or 8 billion people, but we only have 3,000 billionaires. Now, right away, you can see what I'm coming to. Well, over the last year, they just released their report. Over the last year, 2024, those 3,000 people taken together increased their wealth by $6 billion a day.
Wow.
For the 365 days of the year. They became collectively much more wealthy. Okay, you know what that means in simple English? That the inequality of the global capitalist system is making itself worse. We are on a death trip of inequality. And the history of the world suggests you can do that for a while. Sometimes you can do it for quite a while. But in the end, the overwhelming mass of the people watching what is going on and feeling correctly victimized by it rise up. The only real question is not whether, it's only when. And the only next question is, how are they going to fix the problem? And the fix will be temporary or the fix will be permanent, depending on how they change what's going on. My argument is you better change the system from the base up. You better change the way enterprises work, because if you leave in place a system that puts a tiny group of people at the top with all the power to run the enterprise, they're going to take the fruits of it for themselves. And there we go again with the inequality built into the system.
You know, Dr. Wolff, one of the things that many capitalists have said is, I don't know if you remember Wall Street, that movie where the guy said, greed is good. And that is the reasons why even this inequality is something that we should cherish, right? Because again, it is what makes things happen. I pointed out on my program several times that if people were greedy, you wouldn't have billionaires, because the greedy ones, since we're all greedy, we won't allow those greedy ones to excel, number one. Number two, I've often said that if people really wanted to dominate, then we couldn't have just 3,000 billionaires that you talk about. So my question to you, given that narrative that I think has been placed in one of the best ways for folks to understand, I mean, serf, the lord, the slave, the master, now the executive, and the employer, the employee, they're all similar models. Is there something intrinsic to humanity that makes that? Or was there a time in our history where that wasn't the case? Is selfishness of the few inherent or not?
Absolutely not. And the anthropological record makes that clear. Common sense makes that clear. And any knowledge of history that isn't ideologically screwed up knows it. So let's start. Anthropology. It tells us that before slavery in most parts of the world, you had what I called earlier village economies. There were no masters in those villages, no slaves. Nobody owned anybody else. Nobody did. It was done as a collective. Sometimes they said, well, the older people, because they've been around a long time, have a kind of wisdom. So they would turn to the elderly for helping solve the community's problems. But there was a notion that we're all in this life together. We all need each other every day, help each other grow our crops, find our animals, deal with our children. Phrases like, it takes a village to raise a child. That's a remembrance in the human experience of how we used to do it. We did it as a group of equals, and anyone advantaging themselves at the expense of the group was seen to have a mental problem, and people helped them to overcome their individualism that threatened the community. Here's the second piece of evidence. Throughout slavery, throughout feudalism, and throughout capitalism, workers have walked away from enterprises organized in the typical top-down fashion and tried to organize enterprises differently. Today, for example, we have thousands in the United States, in Europe, in many other countries, of organizations called worker co-ops. What do you think that is? Exactly. That's the attempt of workers who walk away from their jobs in capitalist factories, offices, and stores because they want to get together with others like them in an equal relationship, working out of somebody's backyard or garage to set up a business, which they do, and they're very proud. We want one person, one vote. We make all the decisions. Monday to Thursday, we come and we work. On Friday, we don't do work. We sit around and we talk about this business, how we want it to grow, how we want it to work, how to resolve tensions that exist amongst us, and all. But it's all done in a collective way. There's no master. There's no employer. Look, when I have questionnaires to my students in my classes, in all the American universities I've ever taught in, I hand out at the beginning of the semester a little piece of paper, and I say to them, give me your name and what year you're in, what you hope to do in your life, so I have a better understanding of the audience I'm trying to teach. And one of the questions I ask is, what are your hope? What do you hope to have as a job 5 years after you graduate? And the majority, I teach in the state of Massachusetts most of my life, but the majority of my students have always said, I want to be self-employed. All right, let me tell you what that means. It means they don't want to be what their parents are. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be an employee. They've looked at their parents growing up 18 years at home with those parents, and they have said, I don't want to. I want to be my own boss. Well, the best thing would be if you were together with others who didn't want to be employees, and you wouldn't have to have a boss. You could. When I explain that to them, they're all nodding. They get it. No big mystery. No big undertaking. No one had talked to them about it before. But don't tell me the American people are not interested. They are. They have to be shown that it's an option. When I give them literature about all the worker co-ops, they gobble it up. And then I tell them, which is the case, that in places like Italy and Britain, worker co-ops are a much bigger part of the economy than they are here. And so people know about them, see them. Some folks go to work in them. And I say to them as my conclusion, let me ask you a question. Where would you rather work? In an enterprise where people you do not know, whom you do not elect, who are not accountable to you, decide what you do, how you do it, when you do it, where you do it. When you arrive in the morning, they tell you where to sit, what to do. And when you go home at night, they tell you to leave here everything you helped to produce because it's not yours, it's mine. I'm the employer. You go home, one beer, one pizza, and you come back tomorrow and you do it again. Or would you like to work in an enterprise where you're not just an employee, you're one of the people that runs the business, because you don't have employers, employees, you have people who are both. They look at me with stars in their eyes. They never thought it was possible. That's where we have to go, because nothing short of that is going to undo the inequality that oppresses us at every turn.
You know, it's interesting because in that narrative, you spoke about freedom. And, many times when you hear whether Democrat, Republican, or these folks who believe in this system, when you hear them talk about democracy and freedom, they somehow like to equate that with capitalism. I always remind them that one of the second biggest countries in capitalism is China. And I don't think China would be considered a democracy. But also in a democracy, as you mentioned before, you would have where your employees would collectively say, or shouldn't call it employees, where the workers would collectively say, we want to do this, X, Y, or Z, or we see that the market really wants this, because that one guy at the top really can't see it, can he? Right. I mean, they can't see it. Go ahead.
Egberto, let me make it as strong as I know how. Capitalism is not only undemocratic, it is the antithesis. It's the opposite.
Exactly.
Come on. Democracy means, whether you go to ancient Greece, Piraeus, to talk about that, or you want to give modern example. Basic idea of democracy is, if you are affected by a decision in your community, then you must have input into making that decision. Otherwise, you live in an autocracy. There are some people who have power, you don't. The reason we have an election in our town for mayor is because the mayor makes decisions that affect us. And therefore, we have to have power over him. When you walk into a capitalist enterprise, a factory, an office, or a store, there's a boss who tells you what to do. He sure as hell affects you. He starts by affecting you whether you get the job or not, and then he affects you by whether you keep the job or not. Plus, he tells you where to sit and what to do and what tools to use and how to use them. He has enormous power over you. You have a zero power over him. That's not democracy. If we think it ought to be important to vote for the mayor of your town, why do we not think it's important for you to have the power to vote for the leader of your enterprise, where you spend the best hours of your day 5 out of 7 days of the week? If you really believed in democracy, worker co-ops would be the only kind of business you would allow to exist, because that's a democracy. What we have is not. So when the capitalists, who know, by the way, better than most people, how vulnerable they are. They are a tiny group of super rich people. Their greatest fear is that democracy will lead the mass of people to say, who the hell are you telling us what to do? We are the majority. They know that. That's why it's so important for them to dominate politics by buying it, to dominate the mass media by buying it. That money is what they have. Numbers is what we have. And that's the age-old conflict. So when they talk about democracy, don't pay any attention. They don't know what it is, because if they faced it honestly, they'd have to face that their wealth derived from their corporations is based on the opposite of democracy.
It's interesting because, one of the things that I think folks don't understand, you remember capitalism, one of the parts of the definition of capitalism as the efficient allocation of resources has proven to be so false. I mean, wanting to privatize healthcare where we know we have the added expense of feeding the rich. I've always considered the stock system a parasitic system, in that these are people that throw a few bucks out, everybody else work. I have this statement that I've started to make that said, anytime somebody tells you my money works for me, that is an abstraction that says I am a slave master. In other words, somebody else is doing the work and I am actually collecting on that person's work. Why is it, do you think, that so many are so susceptible to be brainwashed into believing that a system where your labor is broken down, that others are benefiting so much from your labor, and you still at all costs protect that system which is abusing you, which is telling you also, I mean, if you take a look at, well, we're going to employ you today. If my bottom line goes down a bit, you are the expendable resource. Why do you think we accept it so easily?
Well, it's the one thing about the United States that I take my hat off to. It is a country, it is a culture that has really done a really enormously effective job shaping people's consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But let me give you an example out of economics. I've been a professor of economics all my life. And I explain to my students the following. When you sit down with a prospective employer looking to get a job, and you discuss it, and he tells you what he's going to want you to do, and you tell him, I want the job, and blah, blah. And then they come to the key question, how much am I going to pay you? And let's suppose the employer says, I'm going to pay you $25 an hour. I want you to come at 8 o'clock and stay till 5, and I'll pay you $25 for every hour, okay? You know something which the ideology in this country wants you not to know. That's very strange, although you're kind of used to it, because for example, the importance of sex in life, and yet the culture pretends that we're not supposed to discuss it, we're not supposed to be interested. There's a phoniness there that everybody knows about. Well, there's one here too, and here's how it goes. You know that if the employer hires you and pays you $25 an hour, it's because during each hour that you work, you add either to the quantity of the outputs of that business or to the quality of the outputs of that business, so that he can get more revenue because of your hours work than he could get if you weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how much more revenue is he going to get? The answer is he would not hire you unless your work produced more revenue than it costs him to get you to come there. So if you think about it for 2 seconds, that he's only going to pay you $25 an hour if during every hour you produce more than $25 of extra value for him to sell at the end of the day. There it is, friends. There's where the inequality comes, because you're going to produce $30 or $40 or $50 worth of output in an hour. He's going to pay you $25, and the rest of it he keeps. You produced it, he gets it. You produced it, you don't get it. That's why you're not wealthy and he is. And there's no need for that at all. The worker collectively could produce pay themselves $25 and each, and then collectively have the excess, what we call the surplus, be decided by the community to run a daycare, to give portions of it to the workers as a bonus. 100 things can be done with it. By the way, you know what a board of directors of a corporation is? It's the group of people who decide what to do with that extra that the workers have all produced for them. And guess what? They give it to themselves in those fat salaries and those beautiful executive offices. That's what it's used for. Not for you, community. For a minority, and a tiny one, rather than for a majority, which would be the democratic way. Inequality is a fruit of the absence of democracy and proves that the democracy is absent, because democratically, we would never give Elon Musk $400 billion while most Americans have trouble paying for their kids to go to college.
Interestingly, he's got $400 billion, and he has not ever, Dr. Wolff, produced anything of value. His engineers his all these other people that have worked for him that don't make millions of dollars, make maybe a few $100,000 if they're at the high end. But of course, we know that he brings in a whole lot of foreign engineers that work at a discount. I mean, it is amazing how the system works. Now, let me ask you to wrap this section up on capitalism. How do we make the transition? Earlier, you were talking about, before we came on air, that the great thing that you're seeing is that more folks are starting to understand these realities.
Yes. Well, I'm a teacher. I've been a professor all my life, and I'm sure it's shaped my ways of thinking in dozens of ways. But here's one of them. I believe that human beings are inherently very creative, and that if you give them information about options and possibilities, it'll take some time, but they will think about them. They will move in that direction the more upset and dissatisfied they are with the way things were inherited, the way they got them from their parents or the previous generation. So, yeah, we're used to capitalism. It's been the dominant system in this country for a century or two, and that makes it powerfully cemented, you might say, in our ways of thinking. But capitalism, especially American capitalism, is in very deep trouble right now. That's something you and I should talk about. It is causing difficulty for more and more Americans. And as they experience that difficulty, for example, there's too much month at the end of the money for large numbers of people, and they have to face that. And they have to face that a dozen eggs is now a major expenditure, and whereas they used to have them for breakfast without thinking about it, on and on. Going to college is unaffordable for millions. Having your own home is an American dream way out of reach for the majority of our young people, and on and on. As this system breaks down, stops working, as the jobs we have are crappy, as our futures don't look any better, the interest in alternatives becomes greater. That's just a normal human adjustment. Here's the thing. The more people like you, especially you, because you have a large audience, you are listened to, people think about the things you say. If people like you, but also ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, if they start thinking about alternatives, like a worker co-op business, for example, they will find the ways. They will be creative in how to do it. Look, there is something called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. There's so many American people organizing co-ops that they have to have a federation And you go to their website and you'll see where they are and what they're doing and how they're growing. Okay, that's something an interested person can find out about. How do you set one up? How do you run one? You won't be starting from scratch because many thousands of people in this country and even more outside have, decades-long experience. In Spain, there's something called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which is the seventh largest corporation in all of Spain. It has its own university that teaches people how to raise the money for a cooperative business, how to run it, how to grow it, on that information, that literature, the teachers, it's all in place. It now only needs people to say, hey, why is it that here in the United States, in business schools, where I have taught in part of my life, we teach only about how to start a capitalist business, how to run a capitalist business? We don't even offer our students courses that say, well, here's an alternative way to run a business. It would have its problems and we would have its solutions to those problems. But you're not in a world that gives you no choice. I love it when Americans have to be told, you claim that you believe in freedom of choice. Well, for you to have freedom to choose between a capitalistically organized business with what we know it does, and a worker co-op based business, you'd have to learn about it in school. You'd have to hear about it on the news. You'd have to have examples in your community where you could go and see how it works. Imagine how a job there would feel and work for you or your family. We don't have any of that. We have a capitalist system that wants us to believe we are stuck in it, that it's the only one, that it's better than all the alternatives. That's what they thought in feudalism. That's what they taught people. That's what they taught in slavery, that God himself decreed that some of us are master-type people and others of us are slave-type. We had to fight our way out of those ways of thinking. And once people did that, that system was done. It may not have known it yet, but it was done. The fact that I'm talking the way I do, the fact that the audiences I face are larger now than they have ever been in my lifetime. Here in the United States, I was born in Ohio. I've lived and worked in America all my life. I have a bigger audience now, much bigger than I ever had. And it's not because of me. It's because these issues are now coming up. And you and I and people like us are some of those that welcome those issues coming up and want to talk about options and actually give the American people the freedom of choice this system otherwise keeps hidden from them.
Dr. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
My pleasure, Egberto.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.